license and registration. You know why I stopped you?
No, sir. I don't believe I committed any violation.
Changed lanes without signaling 3 blocks back. Didn't see that?
I haven't changed lanes in over 2 miles, officer.
We'll see about that. Any weapons or drugs in the vehicle?
No.
Holbrook, turn around and put your hands behind your back.
Wait, you don't understand. I found drugs in his vehicle.
We saw the footage. We planted that evidence, officer.
You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one will be provided for you.
This can't be happening. This can't be happening.
The sunny afternoon of September 21st, 2023, should have been an uneventful drive home for Deputy Sheriff Marcus Johnson, a 15-year veteran of law enforcement who had taken a rare day off to visit his mother in a neighboring town approximately 40 miles from where he served as a command officer in the Harrison County Sheriff's Department. It was 4:47 p.m. when he was driving his personal Honda Accord through a quiet residential neighborhood in the city of Millbrook, respecting the speed limit and traffic laws, wearing casual clothes with no visible indication he was a law enforcement officer. But when Officer Derek Matthews of the Millbrook Police Department activated his patrol lights and signaled for Marcus to pull over for an alleged failure to come to a complete stop at a stop sign, neither man had any idea the next 25 minutes would be captured on body camera and expose years of police misconduct that had ruined the lives of countless innocent Millbrook residents. Marcus Johnson had grown up in a law enforcement family, his father having served as a state police officer for 32 years before retiring as a captain. Marcus had learned from a young age about the importance of integrity in law enforcement, about how a badge carried both power and responsibility, about how a single officer corrupting their position could undermine public trust in the entire system. He had joined the Harrison County Sheriff's Department immediately after college, worked his way from patrol deputy to detective to operations commander, eventually reaching the position of deputy sheriff, overseeing all field operations for the department of 240 officers. Marcus was known by both colleagues in the community as fair but demanding, as someone who held officers under his command to high standards, but also supported them when they did their jobs appropriately. He had developed a reputation for zero tolerance for misconduct, having personally investigated and ended the careers of 3 officers who had crossed ethical lines during his years as commander. Marcus believed law enforcement departments needed to police themselves rigorously because every corrupt or incompetent officer made the work of honest officers harder and more dangerous. Officer Derek Matthews of the Millbrook Police Department represented exactly the type of officer Marcus despised, though Marcus didn't know this yet when he saw patrol lights activate behind him. Matthews was an 11-year veteran who had developed a reputation among certain segments of Millbrook's community as an officer who stopped people without real cause, who found reasons to cite or arrest citizens who had done nothing wrong, who treated certain neighborhoods, particularly those with predominantly Black or Latino populations, as hunting grounds where he could find arrests to inflate his statistics. Matthews had grown up in Millbrook, the son of a mechanic and a homemaker, had dreamed of becoming a police officer since high school. He had graduated near the top of his police academy class in procedural knowledge, but near the bottom in situational judgment and community relations assessments. His instructors had noted Matthews seemed to see policing as a game where arrests were points to be scored rather than as public service where every interaction mattered. But chronic staffing shortages at the Millbrook Police Department meant almost anyone who passed basic requirements was hired regardless of red flags. During Matthews's first years on the force, he had received 7 citizen complaints alleging unjustified stops, illegal searches, or unprofessional conduct. Each complaint had been investigated by Matthews' supervisors, and each had been dismissed as unfounded or as a misunderstanding. The pattern was classic. Citizens, often from marginalized communities, alleged misconduct but were routinely disbelieved against the word of a uniformed officer. Matthews' supervisors either didn't want to see what was happening or actively protected him because his arrests helped the department's numbers look good. But what Matthews' supervisors and colleagues didn't know was the full extent of his corruption. Matthews wasn't just making questionable stops or being rude to citizens. During the last 5 years, he had been systematically planting evidence on people he stopped, fabricating criminal charges against innocent residents to inflate his arrest statistics and build a reputation as a productive officer. Matthews kept small quantities of drugs in a hidden compartment in his patrol car, substances he had confiscated from crime scenes, but never processed through appropriate channels. When he stopped someone, he decided to arrest. He would plant evidence during a search and then claim to have discovered it. Matthews' tactics were particularly insidious because he targeted people he calculated had few resources to fight charges. He stopped young black men driving through white neighborhoods, alleging minor traffic violations, then escalating to searches where he would find small amounts of drugs. He stopped immigrant workers returning from construction shifts, claiming suspicion of DUI, then discovering contraband during vehicle searches. He targeted single mothers from low-income areas, knowing they would likely accept plea deals rather than risk trial because they couldn't afford proper attorneys or time away from work. Over 5 years, Matthews had planted evidence on at least 37 people, resulting in arrests that ruined lives. Some victims lost jobs due to criminal records. Others lost custody of children. Multiple people served jail time for crimes they never committed. And every victim had claimed innocence, claimed drugs had been planted, but no one had believed them against the testimony of a decorated police officer. The system was designed to believe officers, and Matthews had exploited that systemic bias relentlessly. When Matthews saw Marcus's Honda Accord driving through the residential neighborhood that September afternoon, he saw a potential mark. The car was an older model, approximately 2015, but was well maintained. The driver was a black man apparently in his 30s or 40s, driving through a neighborhood that was predominantly white. Matthews had no real reason to stop the vehicle, but he had perfected the art of creating justifications. He followed the Accord for 3 blocks, watching as Marcus stopped at a stop sign, stopped again at a second stop sign, used turn signal appropriately, and drove exactly at the speed limit. Matthews finally decided to claim Marcus hadn't come to a complete stop at the second stop sign, a claim Matthews' dash camera would later prove completely false because Marcus had clearly stopped for a full 3 seconds. Matthews activated his patrol lights and signaled for Marcus to pull over. Marcus, seeing the lights, immediately began looking for a safe place to stop, using his turn signal and pulling into a parking space in front of a residential house. He placed the vehicle in park, kept both hands visible on the steering wheel, and waited for the officer to approach, behavior that was both instinctive from years in law enforcement and conscious of the fact he was a black man being stopped by an officer he didn't know. Matthews approached the driver's side with his body camera recording, but his body language and tone immediately set an atmosphere Marcus recognized as problematic. Matthews didn't offer a professional greeting or explanation of why he had stopped Marcus. Instead, he immediately demanded driver's license and registration, with a tone that was more accusatory than procedural. Marcus politely responded. He would reach into the glove box for registration and then to his wallet for license, a narration officers were taught to do to avoid misunderstandings during traffic stops. Matthews watched with exaggerated suspicion as Marcus retrieved the documents. When Marcus handed over his driver's license, Matthews looked at it only briefly before asking where Marcus was coming from and where he was going. Marcus responded politely he had been visiting family and was heading home. Matthews then asked if Marcus had anything illegal in the vehicle, drugs, weapons, large amounts of cash. The question made Marcus internally alert, because it had no relation to the alleged rolling stop violation Matthews had used as justification for the stop. An officer moving from routine traffic violation to questions about contraband was often a prelude to illegal, search, or unjustified escalation. Marcus responded calmly. He had nothing illegal in the vehicle. Matthews then asked if Marcus would mind if Matthews looked inside the car. Marcus, knowing his rights but also aware refusing could escalate the situation, politely said he would prefer not to consent to a search, but that if the officer had probable cause, he could proceed as necessary. The response was legally appropriate, clearly establishing Marcus wasn't consenting, but not physically interfering if Matthews decided to proceed anyway. Matthews was visibly irritated by the response, apparently expecting automatic compliance. Matthews told Marcus to step out of the vehicle. Marcus calmly asked if Matthews could explain the legal reason for asking him to exit, given this was supposedly a routine traffic stop for a stop sign violation. Matthews responded he didn't need to explain anything, that he was giving a lawful order, and Marcus needed to comply. Marcus recognized that under Pennsylvania law, officers could order drivers out of vehicles during traffic stops without additional justification, so he complied, opening the door slowly and exiting with hands visible. Once Marcus was out of the vehicle, Matthews told him to turn around and place his hands on the roof of the car. Marcus did as instructed, but asked again what the legal basis was for a search given he hadn't consented, and there was no indication of criminal activity. Matthews ignored the question and began patting down Marcus, a search that was technically legal during a traffic stop, but that was clearly going beyond a routine safety check. Matthews was being excessively thorough, checking pockets, feeling around the waistband, clearly looking for anything he could use as justification for further escalation. Finding nothing on Marcus's person, Matthews told him to remain at the side of the vehicle while Matthews searched the car's interior. Marcus objected, saying he hadn't consented to a search, and asking what the probable cause was. Matthews responded Marcus's nervous behavior and hesitation to consent to search created reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, a claim that was both circular and legally questionable. Nervousness during a traffic stop was normal, and refusal to consent to search was a constitutional right, not basis for reasonable suspicion. Marcus remained calm, but firmly stated for Matthews' body camera he was clearly declaring non-consent to search, that he believed the stop and search lacked appropriate legal justification, but that he wasn't physically resisting or interfering. Marcus was creating a clear verbal record for any later review, behavior that came from years of experience documenting encounters for legal proceedings. Matthews seemed to dislike Marcus's narration, but proceeded with the search anyway. Matthews spent approximately 5 minutes searching the interior of Marcus's Accord, opening the glove box, checking under seats, looking in. The center console. He found nothing incriminating because there was nothing to find. Marcus watched through the side mirror, noting Matthews' body language becoming increasingly frustrated as the search produced no results. Marcus had seen this pattern before in officers who were fishing, looking for anything that would justify a stop they never should have made in the first place. After finding nothing in the vehicle's interior, Matthews opened the trunk. Marcus couldn't see what Matthews was doing in the trunk from where he was standing beside the car, but he heard Matthews moving items around. The trunk contained exactly what would be expected: a spare tire, basic tools, some grocery items Marcus had purchased before visiting his mother. There was absolutely nothing illegal or even suspicious. Marcus expected Matthews would finish the search, issue a citation for the alleged rolling stop violation, and allow him to leave. But then Marcus heard Matthews say something that made his blood freeze. Matthews said he had found something in the trunk, that he needed Marcus to stay where he was. Marcus turned slightly to see Matthews holding a small plastic bag containing what appeared to be a white substance. Marcus immediately knew what was happening. He had investigated enough evidence planting cases to recognize the pattern. Matthews was claiming to have found drugs in Marcus's trunk, drugs Marcus absolutely knew weren't there when he had placed groceries there earlier that day. Marcus said clearly and calmly for Matthews' body camera he had just witnessed the officer plant evidence, that his trunk hadn't contained drugs when he was stopped, that he was officially alleging the officer was fabricating evidence. The statement made Matthews pause, clearly not expecting a motorist to have the knowledge or confidence to immediately call out the behavior. Most of Matthews' victims had been so shocked and scared they hadn't thought to establish a verbal record until, much later, Matthews recovered his composure and said Marcus was now being detained for suspected possession of a controlled substance, that Marcus needed to place his hands behind his back. Marcus said he was complying with the order, but that he was maintaining his statement the drugs had been planted. He then added something that made Matthews pause again. Marcus said he was Deputy Sheriff Marcus Johnson of the Harrison County Sheriff's Department, that he was a law enforcement officer with 15 years of experience, and that he knew exactly what Matthews had just done. The revelation of Marcus's identity created a moment of tense silence captured perfectly on Matthews' body camera. Matthews' expression changed from confident authority to something that looked almost like panic, his eyes widening slightly as he processed the implications of having just planted evidence on a fellow law enforcement officer. Matthews tried to recover, saying it didn't matter what Marcus's profession was, that he had found a controlled substance in Marcus's vehicle, and Marcus was being arrested. But there was hesitation in Matthews' voice now, an underlying uncertainty that hadn't been there moments before. Marcus maintained his composure, years of experience teaching him to stay calm, even when a situation was outrageous. He told Matthews he understood Matthews had a job to do, but that Marcus was officially notifying Matthews he had witnessed evidence planting, that Matthews' body camera had captured everything, and that Marcus was requesting Matthews' supervisor respond to the scene immediately. Marcus added that, as a law enforcement officer, he knew exactly which policies and procedures Matthews was violating, that he was familiar with law governing searches and seizures, and that he was prepared to testify under oath about everything that had just occurred. Matthews, now visibly unsettled by Marcus's confidence and knowledge, said he still had to process the arrest, but that a supervisor could respond if Marcus insisted. Matthews returned to his patrol car to call for a supervisor, leaving Marcus standing beside the Accord with hands still on the roof of the car. Marcus used the moment to mentally review exactly what had occurred, timestamps of when Matthews had stopped him, when the search had begun, when Matthews had opened the trunk, how long Matthews had been out of view before claiming to discover drugs. Every detail would matter when this inevitably went to investigation and possibly court. Sergeant Lisa Chen arrived at the scene. Approximately 8 minutes later, exiting a supervisor vehicle with an expression suggesting she had been briefed. This was an unusual situation. Chen was a 20-year veteran who had worked with Matthews for approximately 5 years. She approached Marcus first, asking if he was injured or needed medical assistance. Marcus said he was physically unharmed, but that he needed to report serious officer misconduct. Chen then approached Matthews, who briefed her on the situation from his perspective, claiming he had stopped Marcus for a traffic violation, requested consensual search, which Marcus had refused, then conducted a search based on reasonable suspicion and discovered a controlled substance in the trunk. Marcus waited for Matthews to finish, then politely asked for opportunity to give his account. Chen agreed, and Marcus systematically outlined what had occurred. He explained he had come to a complete stop at the stop sign. Matthews claimed he rolled through, that Matthews had escalated from a routine traffic stop to questions about drugs and weapons without apparent justification, that Matthews had conducted an extensive search of both his person and vehicle without establishing appropriate probable cause, and most critically, that Marcus had heard Matthews moving items in the trunk for a period of time before claiming to discover drugs that absolutely weren't there when Marcus had accessed the trunk earlier that day. Marcus then identified himself as Deputy Sheriff of Harrison County and provided contact information for his supervisor, Sheriff William Bradford. He told Chen he was officially filing a misconduct complaint against Matthews for evidence planting, illegal search, and potential deprivation of civil rights under color of law. Marcus added that, as a law enforcement officer, he recognized the pattern of Matthews' behavior and suspected Matthews had done this before to other people who lacked the knowledge or resources to challenge him effectively. Chen told both officers to remain at the scene while she made calls to determine how to proceed. She first contacted Millbrook Police Chief Richard Torres, explaining the situation. Torres, immediately recognizing this could become a major incident, told Chen to ensure all evidence was preserved, that she should confiscate Matthews' body camera and dash camera immediately to prevent any possibility of tampering, and that he was sending the Internal Affairs Lieutenant to the scene. Torres then contacted Sheriff Bradford of Harrison County to verify Marcus's identity and position. Bradford confirmed Marcus Johnson was indeed Deputy Sheriff, responsible for all field operations in Harrison County, that Marcus had been in law enforcement for 15 years with an exemplary record, and that if Marcus was alleging misconduct, it should be taken extremely seriously. Bradford said he was driving to Millbrook immediately, that he wanted to be present when Marcus gave a formal statement, and that if there was even a possibility of planted evidence, he expected a full and impartial investigation. Bradford added he had known Marcus for a decade, and Marcus wasn't the type of officer who would make false allegations or exaggerate an encounter. While waiting for the Internal Affairs investigator and Bradford to arrive, Chen separated Marcus and Matthews, keeping them on opposite sides of the scene. Matthews was visibly nervous now, pacing near his patrol car, occasionally glancing at Marcus as if trying to assess how serious a problem he was in. Marcus remained calm, leaning against his Accord, mentally preparing the detailed statement he would provide. He had conducted countless misconduct investigations during his career, so he knew exactly what kind of information would be needed. Lieutenant James Morrison of Millbrook Internal Affairs arrived first, approximately 25 minutes after Marcus had initially been stopped. Morrison was an experienced investigator who had investigated multiple complaints against Millbrook officers over the years. He immediately took control of the scene, instructing Chen to seal Matthews' body camera and dash camera in evidence bags and document chain of custody. Morrison then separately interviewed both Matthews and Marcus, obtaining preliminary statements from each. When Morrison interviewed Marcus, he took detailed notes as Marcus outlined the timeline of events, specifics of where he had been standing in relation to the trunk when Matthews was searching it, how long Matthews had been out of view, exactly what Marcus had heard. Marcus provided contact information for the grocery store where he had stopped before visiting his mother, suggesting the store's security camera records could show he had placed only groceries in the trunk and nothing else. Marcus also requested that the complete contents of the trunk be documented and photographed before anything was moved, and that the substance Matthews claimed to have found be tested for fingerprints. Morrison acknowledged these were suggestions from someone who understood criminal investigations. When he interviewed Matthews, Matthews' story was consistent with what he had told Chen, but Morrison noted Matthews was defensive and couldn't provide clear explanation of why he had suspected criminal activity sufficient to justify an extensive search after Marcus refused consent. Matthews said Marcus's nervous behavior and refusal to consent created reasonable suspicion, but when Morrison pressed for specifics of what had been nervous about Marcus's behavior, Matthews gave vague answers. Sheriff Bradford arrived at the scene approximately 15 minutes after Morrison. Bradford was an imposing man in his 50s, with a presence that commanded respect. He greeted Marcus briefly, asking if he was all right, then introduced himself to Morrison and Chief Torres, who had arrived shortly after. Bradford made clear that, while he obviously supported his officer, he expected a completely impartial investigation, and that if evidence showed misconduct had occurred, he expected appropriate accountability regardless of who was involved. Morrison conducted a more detailed search of Marcus's trunk, this time with multiple witnesses present and everything being photographed and videotaped. The trunk contained exactly what Marcus had described: spare tire in the tire compartment, basic tools in a tool kit, and a grocery bag containing bread, milk, eggs, and some snacks. There was absolutely nothing suspicious other than the small plastic bag containing approximately 3 grams of white substance Matthews claimed to have discovered. Morrison carefully packaged the substance in an evidence bag, noting for the record the bag wasn't in an obvious location, but had allegedly been found underneath the toolkit. Morrison then interviewed residents of houses near the scene to determine if anyone had witnessed the stop. An elderly woman named Dorothy Henderson, who lived in the house directly where Marcus had been stopped, said she had been sitting on her porch reading when the stop occurred. Henderson said she had watched the officer pat down the black man, then search the car for several minutes. She noted the officer had spent a notable amount of time in the trunk, longer than would seem necessary to simply look inside. Henderson's testimony corroborated Marcus's account that Matthews had been in the trunk for an extended period. Chief Torres made the decision to place Matthews on administrative leave immediately while the investigation was conducted, recognizing the allegations were serious enough to justify immediate removal of Matthews from patrol. Torres told Matthews he was being placed on paid leave, that he would be contacted by Internal Affairs for a formal interview, and that he should not discuss the case with anyone except his union representative and attorney. Matthews protested he had done nothing wrong, that he had simply discovered drugs during a legal search, but Torres cut him off, saying the decision wasn't open to debate. Marcus was released without charges after giving a complete statement to Morrison. Before leaving, Marcus gave Morrison a copy of his business card and said he was available for additional interviews or to provide any documentation that might be helpful. Marcus also formally requested the investigation include review of Matthews's other cases, particularly those involving alleged drug discoveries during traffic stops, suggesting if Matthews had planted evidence once he had likely done it multiple times. Morrison acknowledged the suggestion was reasonable and promised to bring it to the attention of the broader investigation. When Marcus finally drove away from the scene, it was nearly 6:30 p.m., almost 2 hours after he had initially been stopped. He was emotionally exhausted, but also angry and determined. Marcus thought about how many people had probably been in his exact position. Stopped by Matthews, having evidence planted, but without having the knowledge or resources to challenge what was happening. He thought about how many lives had been ruined by criminal records for crimes people never committed. Marcus's determination to ensure Matthews faced full accountability solidified during that drive home. The internal affairs investigation into Matthews moved quickly. Once body camera and dash camera footage was reviewed, what investigators discovered in the recordings was damning. Matthews' dash camera clearly showed Marcus had come to a complete stop at the stop sign. Matthews claimed he rolled through, proving the initial stop had been based on a false pretext. The body camera captured Matthews escalating the encounter without appropriate justification, ignoring Marcus's refusals of consent and conducting an extensive search without establishing adequate probable cause. More significantly, when investigators reviewed footage of Matthews searching the trunk, they noticed something even Marcus hadn't been able to see from his position. The body camera captured the moment when Matthews reached into his pocket and removed a small plastic bag, then placed it under the toolkit in the trunk before discovering it moments later. The sequence was brief, only approximately 3 seconds, but it was unmistakable once investigators knew what to look for. Matthews had literally videotaped himself, planting evidence, apparently so confident he would never be challenged that he hadn't even tried to hide his action from his own camera. Morrison shared the findings with Torres and with the District Attorney's Office Special Investigations Unit. District Attorney Jennifer Walsh immediately recognized this went far beyond a departmental misconduct issue. Matthews had committed multiple serious crimes, including planting evidence, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and potentially perjury if he had testified falsely in previous cases. Walsh assigned 2 senior prosecutors to work with internal affairs investigators on a comprehensive review of Matthews's cases. The expanded investigation focused on all of Matthews' drug arrest cases from the last 5 years. Investigators identified 39 cases where Matthews had claimed to discover drugs during traffic stops or street encounters, cases that shared a disturbingly similar pattern. In each case, Matthews had stopped individuals, primarily people of color, driving through white neighborhoods or in low-income areas, claimed suspicious behavior or minor violations, conducted searches despite refusals of consent, and then claimed to discover small quantities of drugs, typically 3 to 5 grams of cocaine or methamphetamine. The investigation team began contacting people who had been arrested by Matthews. Many were initially reluctant to speak with authorities, having been traumatized by the experience of being falsely accused and not believed. But when investigators explained the officer who had arrested them was now under criminal investigation for planting evidence, and that there was video recording showing him doing this to a law enforcement officer, multiple previous victims came forward with their accounts. One of the first was Jamal Williams, a 28-year-old black man who had been stopped by Matthews 18 months before while driving home from his job as a certified nursing assistant. Jamal described how Matthews had claimed he rolled through a stop sign, asked to consent to a search which Jamal refused, then searched his vehicle anyway, claiming nervous behavior. Matthews allegedly found a small amount of cocaine under the passenger seat. Jamal had insisted the drugs had been planted, that he had never used drugs in his life, but no one had believed him against the word of a police officer. Jamal accepted a plea deal for possession because his attorney said a jury would believe the officer over him, that going to trial risked a longer prison sentence. The conviction cost Jamal his job at the hospital because they had a zero-tolerance policy for drug offenses. He lost his apartment because he couldn't pay rent without income. He lost shared custody of his 5-year-old daughter because her mother used his criminal record in a custody dispute. Jamal's life had been completely derailed by the false charge, and he had spent 18 months trying to rebuild while dealing with the trauma of having been framed and not believed. Another victim was Maria Gonzalez, a single mother of 3 who had been stopped by Matthews 2 years before while driving home after picking up overtime hours cleaning offices. Matthews claimed he suspected she was under the influence, conducted a field sobriety test that Maria passed, then searched her car anyway, claiming suspicion of drugs. He allegedly found methamphetamine in her purse. Maria had sworn the drugs had been planted, that she had never even seen methamphetamine before, but the prosecutor offering a plea deal said she faced 5 years in prison if convicted at trial. Maria accepted a deal involving probation and community service to avoid jail that would have separated her from her children. But the conviction triggered a Child Protective Services investigation that was an 18-month nightmare. She nearly lost her children to the foster system. She lost her job because she couldn't explain absences for court appearances without revealing her criminal record. She developed severe anxiety and depression from the stress of being falsely accused and having to accept guilt for something she didn't do. As more victims came forward, the pattern became undeniable. Matthews had systematically targeted vulnerable people, people with limited resources to fight charges, people the system was less likely to believe. He had ruined lives to inflate his arrest statistics and build a reputation as a productive officer. And he had gotten away with it for years because the system was designed to believe officers over citizens, particularly citizens from marginalized communities. The investigation also uncovered how Matthews had obtained the drugs he was planting. Review of evidence room records revealed Matthews had signed out small quantities of controlled substances from the evidence room on multiple occasions, claiming he needed them for training sessions or educational presentations, but there was no documentation of any trainings or presentations corresponding to the dates when Matthews had removed substances. The evidence custodian had noted inconsistencies but had failed to report them because Matthews was a respected officer and the custodian had assumed it must have been paperwork error. Additional evidence came from analysis of GPS positioning from Matthews's patrol car during stops, where he claimed to find drugs. Data showed that in multiple cases, Matthews had been at locations for significantly longer periods than would be typical for a routine traffic stop, where drugs were found in an obvious location. The extended periods were consistent with Matthews taking time to plant evidence in a way that seemed convincing, rather than simply discovering something that was already there. District Attorney Walsh convened a press conference 3 weeks after Marcus's stop to announce criminal charges against Matthews. The room was packed with reporters from local and regional media, community members who had been affected by Matthews's arrests, and representatives from civil rights organizations who had been monitoring the case. Walsh was accompanied by Chief Torres, Sheriff Bradford, and Lieutenant Morrison. The expressions on their faces made clear what they were about to announce was both serious and deeply troubling. Walsh began by explaining that after an intensive 3-week investigation involving review of hundreds of hours of body camera and dash camera footage, analysis of evidence room records, interviews with dozens of witnesses, and consultation with forensic experts, her office was filing 23 criminal charges against Officer Derek Matthews. The charges included multiple counts of planting evidence, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, perjury, falsifying government documents, and theft of evidence from the evidence room. If convicted on all charges, Matthews faced a potential sentence of up to 40 years in prison. Walsh said the video evidence of Matthews planting drugs in Marcus Johnson's vehicle was the smoking gun that had triggered the broader investigation, but that what investigators discovered went far beyond that single incident. She explained Matthews had systematically planted evidence on at least 37 people over a 5-year period, ruining the lives of innocent working citizens to advance his career. Walsh said her office was committed to ensuring Matthews faced full justice, and that all his victims received every available resource to clear their records and pursue restitution. Chief Torres spoke next, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine shame. He said the Millbrook Police Department had failed to appropriately supervise Matthews despite multiple red flags that should have triggered intervention earlier. Torres acknowledged 7 citizen complaints against Matthews over the years had been inadequately investigated and dismissed, that Matthews' pattern of behavior should have been recognized and addressed before he could victimize so many people. Torres announced 3 supervisors who had failed to appropriately investigate complaints against Matthews were being placed on administrative leave while their own conduct was reviewed. Torres also announced the department was implementing comprehensive reforms, including a requirement that all citizen complaints be reviewed by an independent internal affairs unit rather than officers' direct supervisors, installation of rear-angle dash cameras that would capture officers' actions in trunks and back seats of vehicles, and mandatory training on implicit bias and constitutional policing for all officers. Torres said that while these reforms couldn't undo the damage Matthews caused, they were designed to prevent future instances of similar misconduct. Sheriff Bradford spoke briefly, praising Marcus's professionalism during the encounter with Matthews, and emphasizing Deputy Sheriff Johnson had done exactly what an exemplary officer should do when witnessing misconduct, remaining calm, documenting everything clearly, and working through appropriate channels to ensure a full investigation. Bradford noted that if Marcus hadn't been a law enforcement officer with knowledge and resources to challenge Matthews' actions, he would likely have become another victim of Matthews' framing, and that this highlighted how vulnerable ordinary citizens were to corrupt officers. During the question and answer session following the announcements, reporters asked why Matthews had been able to operate for so long without detection. Walsh acknowledged the system had failed at multiple levels. Supervisors had failed to appropriately investigate complaints. The evidence custodian had failed to report irregularities. In Matthews' checkouts of controlled substances, prosecutors who had prosecuted Matthews' cases had failed to question the suspicious pattern of his drug discoveries, and public defenders who had represented Matthews' victims had often pressured clients to accept plea deals rather than challenge an officer's credibility. One reporter asked about Marcus Johnson and whether he would be available for interviews. Bradford responded Marcus had provided every possible assistance to the investigation, but that he had requested privacy while focusing on his responsibilities in Harrison County. Bradford added, Marcus didn't see himself as a hero, but simply as an officer who had done his duty, and that the real heroes were Matthews' victims who had maintained their claims of innocence for years, despite not being believed. The press conference received extensive coverage in local and regional media. The story of a police officer systematically planting evidence on innocent citizens resonated beyond Millbrook, leading to national discussions about police accountability, evidence planting, and how the criminal justice system often failed the people it was supposed to protect. Multiple civil rights organizations called for reforms, including requirements that all police interactions be video recorded, independent review of all misconduct complaints, and ending qualified immunity that protected officers from civil accountability. Walsh's office began the process of reviewing every conviction resulting from a Matthews arrest. Prosecutors contacted all 37 individuals identified as likely victims of evidence planting, offering to vacate convictions and clear records. Some accepted immediately, relieved to finally have their claims of innocence vindicated. Others were more cautious, having been traumatized by the experience of not being believed when they first claimed evidence had been planted. Jamal Williams was among the first to have his conviction vacated. He appeared at the court hearing with his mother and daughter, tears running down his face when the judge formally dismissed charges and ordered his record cleared. Jamal told reporters outside court the vindication was bittersweet because it came too late to save his job or prevent years of suffering, but that he was grateful truth had finally come out. He expressed hope his case would help prevent others from experiencing what he had endured. Maria Gonzalez also had her conviction vacated, but the emotional impact of years of falsely carrying a criminal record had left deep scars. She developed severe distrust of law enforcement and struggled with anxiety whenever she saw a police car. Her attorney filed a civil lawsuit against Matthews, the Millbrook Police Department, and the city, seeking damages for false arrest, emotional distress, and lost wages. Multiple other Matthews victims filed similar lawsuits, with attorneys predicting the city's total liability could exceed $15 million. Matthews was arrested at his home early one morning, approximately 2 weeks after charges were filed. Video footage of two internal affairs officers leading Matthews handcuffed from his house while neighbors watched was widely shared on social media. Matthews was processed and released on $250,000 bail that his attorney posted. He was placed on house arrest, with electronic monitoring while awaiting trial, forbidden from leaving the county or having contact with any of his victims. The police union initially announced it would defend Matthews, claiming he was being scapegoated and that the district attorney's office was overreacting to political pressure. But after body camera footage showing Matthews planting drugs in Marcus's vehicle was leaked to media, the union quietly withdrew support, recognizing defending Matthews would be a public relations nightmare and morally indefensible. Matthews was left to hire a private criminal defense attorney, exhausting his savings in the process. Matthews' attorney tried to argue the body camera footage had been misinterpreted, that Matthews had simply been rearranging items in the trunk when he discovered drugs already present there. But the explanation didn't withstand scrutiny when experts analyzed the footage frame by frame, clearly showing Matthews reaching into his own pocket rather than the trunk area, removing a sealed plastic bag rather than discovering something already present, and deliberately placing it under the toolkit before discovering it. The defense also tried to argue some of Matthews' previous arrests could have been legitimate, even if this one was bad, but the pattern of his cases made the argument impossible to sustain. Statistics showed Matthews found drugs in approximately 67% of searches he conducted, a rate that was 4 times higher than the department average and that was statistically impossible to explain through legitimate police work alone. Experts in statistical analysis testified Matthews' discovery rate indicated either he was spotting people transporting drugs with superhuman accuracy or he was planting evidence. As the trial date approached, pressure on Matthews intensified. Media covered the story extensively, with multiple victims giving interviews describing how his false arrests had destroyed their lives. Protesters frequently appeared outside court during pre-trial hearings, carrying signs with the names of the 37 known victims and demanding maximum sentencing. Matthews' family, previously supporting him, began distancing themselves as evidence of his guilt became inescapable. 3 days before Matthews' trial was scheduled to begin, his attorney approached the prosecutor with a plea agreement proposal. Matthews was willing to plead guilty to 17 of the 23 charges in exchange for prosecution recommending concurrent rather than consecutive sentencing, effectively reducing maximum prison time from 40 years to 28 years. Walsh consulted with Matthews' victims before making a decision, recognizing they had more personal stake in the outcome than anyone. Walsh eventually decided to accept the plea agreement, but with additional strict conditions. The agreement required Matthews to formally confess to planting evidence in all 37 identified cases, that he provide complete sworn testimony about his methods, that he waive all rights to appeal the conviction, and that he participate in a videotaped interview describing his crimes in detail for use in law enforcement training. The guilty plea hearing was held in a packed courtroom with virtually all 37 identified victims present, along with their family members, reporters, and community observers. Judge Thomas Richardson conducted the proceeding with the gravity the moment required. Richardson made Matthews stand and face each victim as he confessed to planting evidence in their case, a process that took over an hour and that left multiple victims crying as they finally heard the officer who had ruined their lives admit what he had done. When Richardson asked Matthews why he had committed these crimes, Matthews gave an answer that sounded rehearsed, but that contained a grain of truth. He said he had started with a genuine belief that people he was targeting were probably criminals anyway, that he was simply accelerating justice by planting evidence on people he knew were guilty of something, even if he couldn't prove it. The victim impact statement phase of the hearing lasted almost 4 hours, as person after person described how Matthews's false arrest had destroyed aspects of their lives. Jamal Williams brought a photo of his daughter, holding it as he described not being able to see her grow during the months he lost shared custody. He talked about how she had asked if he was a bad man, like her mommy said, about having to explain to a 6-year-old child the concept of someone lying about you and the system believing the lie. Maria Gonzalez brought letters from her therapist documenting diagnoses of severe anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder resulting directly from being falsely arrested and nearly losing her children. David Chen described in detail the process of losing his business after his liquor license was revoked because of the drug conviction, bringing financial records showing how his thriving restaurant had generated $180,000 in annual revenue before the arrest. Richardson listened to each victim with visible attention, occasionally making notes, but mostly simply witnessing the depth of harm Matthews had caused. When victim statements were finally complete, Richardson took a brief recess before proceeding to sentencing. When court reconvened, he delivered one of the most severe sentencing speeches court observers could recall hearing. Richardson said in 31 years on the bench, he had sentenced murderers, rapists, drug traffickers, and every manner of violent criminal. But few cases had disturbed him as deeply as this one, because Matthews had betrayed a fundamental trust that civil society depended upon. Richardson sentenced Matthews to 28 years in state prison, with parole eligibility only after serving 23 full years, specifying the sentence should be served in a maximum security facility, given the calculated nature of the crimes. Matthews was taken into custody immediately after sentencing. Footage of him being escorted from court by 2 corrections officers, now wearing an orange prison jumpsuit instead of the blue police, uniform he had worn for 11 years, was broadcast on local news that evening. As a former law enforcement officer, Matthews would be kept completely separated from the general prison population for the entire duration of his sentence. This meant de facto solitary confinement, 23 hours per day in an 8 by 10 foot cell, 1 hour of exercise alone in an enclosed outdoor area, all meals delivered to his cell, minimal human contact limited to prison guards and occasional visits through glass. Civil lawsuits by Matthews's victims against the city of Millbrook moved through the court system over the following 18 months. The city initially tried to defend the cases vigorously, but as discovery produced internal records showing supervisors had routinely dismissed complaints against Matthews, that the department lacked adequate training on constitutional policing, and that performance metrics had incentivized arrests over quality policing, the city's defense collapsed. The city eventually agreed to a comprehensive settlement totaling $22,300,000, an amount significantly larger than municipalities typically paid in police misconduct cases. Jamal Williams received $785,000, Maria Gonzalez received $820,000, and David Chen received $950,000, the largest individual amount from the settlement. Marcus Johnson, whose encounter with Matthews had exposed the entire scheme, declined to participate in the civil settlement, despite technically being a victim. Marcus explained he hadn't suffered real harm compared to other victims, that he had been able to protect himself because of his position, and that he thought it would be inappropriate to take money when others had lost so much more. Instead, Marcus dedicated considerable time working with criminal justice reform organizations to develop training programs based on his case. Marcus collaborated with the Innocence Project and other civil rights organizations to create a 3-hour training presentation titled Recognizing and Preventing Evidence Planting. The program used body camera footage from Marcus's encounter with his approval as a central example, analyzing each step of how Matthews had executed the evidence planting. The training was eventually adopted by law enforcement departments in 17 states, reaching thousands of officers. Chief Torres implemented comprehensive reforms across the Millbrook Police Department over the following 2 years. All body cameras were upgraded to models that couldn't be turned off by individual officers, and that automatically activated when weapons were drawn, or patrol lights activated. Torres also completely overhauled the department's citizen complaint system, with all complaints now reviewed by an independent internal affairs unit reporting directly to the chief rather than line supervisors. An early warning system was implemented identifying officers with problematic patterns before misconduct escalated to criminal violations. Matthews' case inspired legislation at the state level, with a bill known as the Marcus Johnson Law passing the state legislature 2 years after Matthews' sentencing, mandating body cameras for all officers, independent review of complaints, and mandatory training on constitutional policing. Marcus continued serving as deputy sheriff in Harrison County for 3 years after the incident, before deciding to run for sheriff when the incumbent retired. During his campaign, opponents tried to use the Matthews encounter against him, claiming Marcus had only avoided arrest because of his position. But voters rejected these attacks, recognizing Marcus had exposed corruption rather than participated in it. Marcus won the election with 63% of votes, a strong mandate that reflected the community's confidence in him. As sheriff, Marcus implemented many of the reforms he had advocated for after the Matthews case, establishing a departmental integrity unit focused specifically on identifying and addressing potential misconduct before it escalated. Marcus maintained relationships with multiple Matthews victims, occasionally appearing at events together focused on criminal justice reform. 5 years after Matthews' sentencing, reforms in Millbrook had produced measurable changes both in department statistics and in community perceptions. Citizen complaints about unjustified stops fell 71% compared to the 5-year period before Matthews' case. Use of force declined 48%. Surveys showed community trust in the police department had improved from 28% before the scandal to 61% 5 years later. Multiple departments from other jurisdictions sent representatives to study Millbrook's reforms, using them as a model for their own policy changes. The Millbrook Police Department, surprisingly, became known as an example of how a department could confront misconduct honestly and implement meaningful changes in response. The story of Marcus Johnson exposing Derek Matthews remained in public consciousness as an example both of how the system could fail and how accountability was possible when the right people were in the right place at the right moment. The case highlighted the importance of resources and knowledge in navigating the justice system, an uncomfortable reality that explained why so many of Matthews's earlier victims hadn't been able to challenge him successfully. This disparity became a central point in discussions about the need for systemic reforms, rather than simply counting on individuals having the means to fight injustice. For Marcus, the experience had permanently shaped his perspective on law enforcement and the vulnerabilities of citizens when facing a corrupt officer. He often said the most frightening minutes of his life weren't when Matthews stopped him, but when he realized that without his position, his knowledge, and his resources, he would have been just another voiceless victim whose claims would never have been believed.